In this demo, I want to show you some of the basics of collection views and working with those to control the current object within a data-bound collection. I'm going to change the way our form works slightly so that when an order is selected in the data grid in the middle here, its details show up in the fields down below. To do that implies some currency between the form at the bottom and the data grid in the middle. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the XAML and go find my data grid and add another property on it called isSynchronizedWithCurrentItem. Now the key thing to understand here is anytime you data bind to a collection, such as orders here, or customers here, or order statuses here, WPF is always going to be wrapping your collection in a collection view. And collection views are something that support a number of things. We'll look at more details in a later module on binding collection-oriented controls. But one of the most important things the collection view does is keeps track of a current item within a data-bound collection. That current item in our case can correspond to a selected item in something like a data grid, combo box, or list box. And the isSynchronizedWithCurrentItem is basically a signal to WPF that says, I already know you're going to wrap this collection in a collection view, so anytime I select something on this, make sure it is marked as the current item in the corresponding collection view for this collection. Next, I'm going to drop in here and replace the grid that has our add order form in it. All I did here is I put some minor changes. One is that at a grid level, notice that I'm setting the data context for the grid as a whole to the exact same collection that my data grid is bound to. When WPF wraps a collection in a collection view, it'll create one collection view for all references to that same collection. So even though this data context is pointing through this binding and this item source is pointing through this binding, they end up pointing to the same collection view instance. So if I select an item in the data grid and it sets the current item, it's also implicitly setting the current item for the collection view that's going to be used for this grid. Down inside of the grid now, instead of saying newOrder.id and newOrder.orderDate and newOrder.itemsTotal, we're just saying ID, order date, and items total, because the data context has already been restricted down implicitly to a single order. Even though the data context is pointing to an entire collection here, when you have a binding that results in a single value like this, it knows enough to use the value off of the current item in that collection. If it sees that the data context is a collection, it will grab the current item in that collection through the collection view. And then this path will resolve against that current item. Now, because of restricting the data context for this entire grid to that collection, I have to do some additional gymnastics here for binding this combo box, which really wants to get to the order statuses collection that's on the window itself. I'll get into more details on relative source bindings in the next module, but conceptually what this binding is doing is reaching up to the window level, dotting down to its data context, which happens to be a reference to the window itself, and then going to the order statuses property that's on that. So with those bindings in place, I can now go ahead and run. And notice that when I select in the data grid, the order that the form is bound to at the bottom is changing along with my selections. And that's happening even though the data context for those individual elements is really a collection. The bindings themselves are smart enough to go to that collection, see it's a collection view, ask for the current object, and then apply their path to the current object. Now, what if we wanted to programmatically control what the current item is? I'm going to go up here and replace my data grid with a stack panel that contains the data grid. Inside that stack panel, I have two buttons sitting right atop the data grid that allow me to move the focus, if you will, or the selection within the data grid up and down. And then I still have the isSynchronizedWithCurrentItem on my data grid. The additional stuff here is just some styling to make it very apparent what the selected row is by drawing a blue box around it. Now I need some click event handlers for those buttons, so I'll drop into the code behind. So I'm just going to go to the bottom of the code behind here and add the event handlers. In the move down one, you can see what we're doing is we're going to a class called collectionViewSource, and we call getDefaultView, and we pass it a reference to the same collection that was being data bound to by both the data grid and the grid for the order form. Calling this basically gives you a reference to that collection view that's wrapping that collection that both bindings are using. Once we have that reference, we can use the exposed API on collection view to do a number of things. One thing is we can check the current position and get an index back of where it is in the collection. And then we can command it to move to different positions. So in this case, to move down, we're making sure we're not already at the last item with this comparison. And for moving up, we're making sure we're not already on the first item. To move down, we say move current to next. To move up, we say move current to previous. So with that code in place, I can run, I can click the down arrow, and you can see the highlight moving, click the up arrow, and it moves back up. So we're able to control the current position programmatically using the iCollection View interface. And again, we'll see other things we can do with collection views more in a later module.